So think back for a second to 1972.
Okay, 1972.
Right. If you look at women in the United States back then, they faced these, massive social and institutional barriers. I mean, they had way fewer economic opportunities, fewer legal protections, and arguably just far less social freedom than they do today.
Oh, absolutely. The landscape was completely different.
It was. But here is the wild part. According to highly comprehensive sociological data, women in 1972 were measurably happier than they are right now.
Which just sounds so counterintuitive.
Right. I mean, how is it possible that as every single legal and material barrier gets, systematically dismantled over the last 50 years, how did female self-reported happiness not soar? It actually plummeted.
Yeah, it's a profound diagnostic puzzle, really.
It is. And today we are taking a deep dive into a really controversial new book that claims to have the answer. And I'm warning you right now, it is an answer that is making a lot of people incredibly uncomfortable.
I mean, yeah, that is putting it mildly.
So, to you listening right now, have you ever felt like the rules of modern relationships and success are, I don't know, somehow rigged, but you just can't quite put your finger on how the game is actually being played?
Like something is just fundamentally off.
Exactly. Because we look around today and we see these skyrocketing divorce rates.
Yeah.
Right? We see this massive, exhausting civilizational burnout from the pressure of having it all.
Oh, yeah. The having it all burnout is very real.
And underneath it all, simmering just below the surface, there's this silent, bubbling resentment brewing in homes across the world. And that's what we are unpacking today. But before we jump into the deep end here, do us a really quick favor, hit the like button and subscribe to the show.
Yes, please do.
Today's deep dive is a really comprehensive, intensely detailed review of a highly controversial new ebook. If you find this discussion intriguing, or if you just want to see the data for yourself, we strongly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy it.
Yeah, the data in there is something you kind of have to read to believe.
For sure. And you can also follow the author's Substack at Conrad Riker. That's at ConradDnRiker. So let's get into it. What is this book?
Great. So the book we are unpacking today is titled Women Want Power, but Love Cancels Will for Power. It's by Sophie Marie Eve Riker, copyrighted in 2026.
Quite a title.
It really is. And we need to establish some crucial framing right up front because, look, this is not your standard dry sociological study.
No, not at all.
This book has essentially become this massive touchstone, almost a foundational text for men's rights activists and what is often referred to as the red-pilled manosphere.
Right, so we are in deep, highly politicized waters here.
Exactly. The core premise of Riker's work is that modern institutions, all of them, have been completely captured by feminist and Marxist ideology. And according to her, understanding the history of our institutions before they were captured is essential because this institutional capture is not leading to some utopia of equality. She argues it's leading directly to societal decay and relational collapse.
Which brings us to our strict neutrality disclaimer for this deep dive. And we really need to state this emphatically to you, the listener. We are not taking sides today.
Right. We are not endorsing anything.
Not at all.
Yeah.
We are not endorsing these highly politically charged, right-wing, anti-feminist viewpoints. That is not what we do here. Our mission in this deep dive is to impartially report on the claims, decode the really complex arguments within the text, and help you understand the history and the philosophy that's driving this specific movement.
Exactly. We're just the messengers trying to unpack this massive deconstruction she's doing.
So where does Riker actually begin this? Because looking at the text, she doesn't start with macroeconomic data, does she?
No, she doesn't. She actually starts incredibly small. She starts with herself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, she opens the book with her own origin story, and she paints this very vivid picture of herself at 26 years old. She's highly educated, she's gainfully employed, and at the time, she considered herself a fiercely successful modern feminist.
So she had essentially executed the cultural playbook perfectly.
Down to the letter. She secured the degree, she negotiated the salary, she achieved what she thought was total financial and social independence.
Right. The exact blueprint of modern female empowerment that we're all sold.
Precisely. And yet she describes sitting in this expensive apartment that she paid for herself, by the way, eating dinner across from this deafening silence that, no amount of therapy jargon or self-care routines could fill.
Wow.
She was, in her own words, deeply and thoroughly miserable.
So she did everything right and still felt empty.
Exactly. And it was from this really intense personal realization, this jarring disconnect between the promise of empowerment and the reality of her isolation, that she began to build her central theory. And she calls this theory the grand swap.
The grand swap. Okay, so that implies a transaction, right? A deal that was struck. What exactly are we swapping here?
So the theory posits that starting around the mid 20th century, women were offered the social contract that was aggressively branded as ultimate liberation. They were sold the idea of trading the cooperative, maybe somewhat unglamorous, but highly supportive architecture of the traditional family for the promise of competitive autonomy.
So basically, give up the traditional home life for the corporate ladder.
Exactly. The pitch was simple: leave the domestic sphere, enter the competitive marketplace, and you will achieve pure self-sovereignty. You will be a master of the universe.
But Riker argues that this bill of goods was flawed, right?
She argues it was catastrophic. According to her, in making this swap, women traded the tangible security of the family for the mere illusion of independence. And ultimately, they get neither true love nor true power in the end.
Okay, I really want to dig into the data she uses to support this, because she's not just, philosophizing here. She points directly to the Stevenson and Wolfer's paradox from 2009, right?
Yes, she leans heavily on that.
Let's unpack the methodology there, because I remember when that study dropped, it completely baffled mainstream sociologists.
Oh, it sent shockwaves through the field. Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers, they were researchers at the Wharton School, they analyzed decades of data from the General Social Survey.
And what were they looking at exactly?
They were looking at subjective well-being in the United States, tracking it from the 1970s all the way through the 2000s. And the timeline Riker overlays on this data is really striking. Just think about the legal milestones during that period.
Right, like the big civil rights and financial changes.
Exactly. In 1974, you have the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. That meant women could finally open bank accounts and get credit cards without a male cosigner.
Which is a massive fundamental economic barrier completely removed.
Huge. And then the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. Then you look at the 80s and 90s and you see this massive explosion in female college graduation rates, to the point where women now actually outnumber men on campuses.
And workforce participation just skyrockets.
Right. So from a strictly materialist legal standpoint, the keys to the castle were handed over, the systemic barriers were gone.
But the Stevenson and Wolfers data showed the exact opposite of what everyone expected, right? Despite every objective measure of life improving for women, female self-reported happiness declined.
It declined both absolutely and relative to men.
Yeah, the data showed, a 12 percentage point drop in happiness since 1972?
Yes, 12 percentage points, which is statistically huge.
I mean, I struggle with this a bit because the obvious counterargument, the one most sociologists reached for at the time, was the second shift theory.
Right, the double burden.
Yeah, the idea that women are unhappier now because they are carrying this double burden. Like they have to work a 40-hour week in the corporate world, and then they come home and still have to do the vast majority of the childcare and the housework. Does Riker just ignore that?
No, she addresses it head on, actually. But she rejects the second shift as the primary driver of the misery.
Okay, so why does she think they're miserable then?
Riker argues that the misery doesn't stem from simply doing too many tasks. It stems from a profound crisis of meaning and this unnatural isolation. She says the second shift argument assumes that, if men just did more laundry, the psychological despair of the modern woman would just magically evaporate.
Right.
Riker says that is a fundamental misdiagnosis. The unhappiness, she claims, comes from realizing that the competitive autonomy they were promised is actually just a different, much colder form of servitude.
Servitude to what?
Servitude to a corporation, to a landlord, to a tax bracket, rather than service to a covenant family that actually loves them back.
Wow. To put this in financial terms, reading her analysis of the grand swap kind of reminds me of a predatory balloon mortgage.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it. How so?
Well, it sounds like she's saying feminism essentially offered women this zero-down, interest-only mortgage on a luxury lifestyle in their 20s.
Right.
Like, you get all the freedom, all the casual dating, the intense career focus, with absolutely none of the heavy grounding commitments of marriage and children.
Right.
But, a balloon mortgage eventually comes due.
It always does.
And now, in their 30s and 40s, these women are getting hit with the massive principal payments. The biological clock is ticking, the isolation sets in, and they have this realization that corporate HR doesn't actually care about them when they go home at night.
Yes.
And they're waking up realizing they literally cannot afford the house they were sold.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize Riker's argument, and she actually details exactly how modern women react when that balloon payment comes due. She calls it the sovereignty at choice. Victimhood at consequence. Double move.
Sovereignty of choice, victimhood at consequence. Okay, explain the mechanics of that. That sounds like a trap.
It is. Riker argues that the modern woman demands the right to make every consequential life decision as an independent sovereign.
Like a king.
Exactly. She demands the autonomy to choose her career over a family, to prioritize casual relationships over a covenant marriage, to just live entirely for herself.
Which is the pitch of empowerment.
Right. But the moment the bill for that choice arrives, the moment the isolation sets in or the career feels incredibly hollow, she immediately switches registers.
She changes her tune?
Yes. She stops speaking like a sovereign king and starts accounting for the cost as a dependent victim. She blames systemic barriers or the patriarchy or toxic masculinity for the outcome of the very choices she demanded the absolute freedom to make.
So if a woman isn't finding happiness in this autonomy, and she's oscillating back and forth between acting like a sovereign and claiming to be a victim, what exactly is the behavioral model she has adopted?
Well, that leads us perfectly into one of the most provocative concepts in the entire book. It's Riker's archetype of the lazy queen.
Lazy queen. I mean, that just sounds designed to make people angry.
It is definitely provocative, but it is crucial to understand that she isn't using this term just as like a disparaging insult. She maps it out as a highly specific set of behavioral expectations.
Okay, so how does she define it?
She defines the lazy queen as a woman who demands the reverence, the prestige, and the unquestioned status of a traditional divine right monarch, but who absolutely refuses to apply anything more than the effort budget of a dependent child.
She wants the heavy gold crown, but she refuses to bear the weight of it.
Precisely. She wants the kingdom just handed to her. And to ground this in history, Riker uses a really fascinating case study, Helen Gurley Brown.
Oh, the legendary editor of Cosmopolitan magazine.
Yes, if you want to trace the genesis of the modern having it all fantasy, Riker says you have to look at Helen Gurley Brown in the 1960s and 70s.
Right, because she completely reinvented that magazine.
She took over Cosmo and transformed it from this dull, family-oriented publication into a multi-million-dollar global empire. And what was the product she was actually selling?
The ultimate single girl lifestyle.
Exactly. She was selling the ultimate lazy queen fantasy to millions of American women. The fantasy of the glamorous career, the unattached, exciting sex life, total independence from men, all while somehow maintaining pristine beauty and avoiding any traditional domestic duties whatsoever.
But Riker points out the massive hypocritical reality behind that glossy empire, doesn't she?
That's the key. While Helen Gurley Brown was instructing millions of young women to embrace this fierce, independent single life and to never ever settle for a traditional marriage, she herself was married.
Right.
And not just married. She relied incredibly heavily on her husband, David Brown, who was a massively successful film producer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Raker points out that David Brown provided the financial backstop, the high-level industry connections, and the emotional stability that actually allowed Helen to take the wild professional risks she took.
So she was selling a map to this utopian city of female independence, but she didn't actually live in that city herself?
No, she did not.
She lived in the fortified castle of a traditional, very well-funded marriage.
Exactly. Riker even notes that Brown admitted in private letters that the lifestyle she sold in Cosmo wasn't a sustainable blueprint for actual human happiness. It was a performance.
It was just content.
It was a product designed to keep an audience entertained and buying magazines. She effectively monetized female loneliness by selling an impossible ideal.
And this impossible ideal introduces what Riker calls the effort status paradox.
Yes.
If we strip away the magazine gloss here, what are the actual mechanics of this paradox in the real world?
Well, the effort status paradox looks at the historical reality of how power is actually acquired. Because throughout human history, high status, whether that is sitting on a literal throne or holding the corner office or sitting at the head of a boardroom table, that status was earned through extreme risk exposure.
Right, brutal competition.
Exactly. Relentless, exhausting, life-shortening labor. The king who ruled the city first had to bleed on the battlefield to secure it. If a modern CEO runs a company into the ground, he loses everything. High status was always inextricably linked to high liability.
But Riker's arguing that modern feminism basically attempts to sever that link.
She argues exactly that. She says the modern feminist framework demands the equal distribution of high status. So, 50% of the board seats, equal representation in the C-suite, the massive executive paychecks. But they want that without demanding that women undertake the same extreme risk, physical destruction or liability that men historically absorbed to build those very institutions.
So it's like wanting the executive paycheck without the grueling 80-hour work weeks that literally destroy your health. Wanting the title without the total accountability of failure.
And to defend this inherently contradictory position, Riker claims that modern women have perfected the use of the Motte-Bailey fallacy.
Okay, let's pause and explain that, because it's a brilliant rhetorical concept, but it can be a little dense for people who haven't heard it. How does a Motte-Bailey actually work in practice?
Okay, let's use a modern analogy before we apply it to Riker's text. Imagine a politician on a debate stage. A Motte-Bailey is this deceptive rhetorical strategy, and it's named after a medieval castle layout.
Right.
The Motte is the fortified stone tower up on a steep hill. It is incredibly easy to defend, but it's small, it's cramped. You really wouldn't want to live there every day.
Okay, so that's the Motte. What's the Bailey?
The Bailey is the lush, expansive, beautiful courtyard down below the hill. It's wonderful to live in, you have tons of space, but if an invading army shows up, there are no walls. It is utterly indefensible.
So how does the politician use this? They make a wild, sweeping, highly controversial claim. So they're basically happily living out in the expansive Bailey.
Exactly. But the moment a journalist challenges that wild claim with hard facts, the politician immediately retreats up the hill into the fortified Motte. They substitute their wild claim for a much smaller, universally agreeable statement that no one can argue with.
And then once the journalist backs off because they can't argue with the Motte,
The politician sneaks right back down into the Bailey to keep spreading the wild claim. It's a bait and switch.
okay, I get it.
Yeah.
So how does Riker apply this medieval castle warfare to modern gender dynamics?
Riker argues that a modern woman will live very comfortably in the Bailey of systemic victimhood. In this Bailey, she demands endless societal accommodations, corporate quotas, lowered physical standards in the military or the police force, and infinite emotional support. And she justifies all of this by claiming that the entire system is rigged against her and she needs special protection.
Okay, but what happens when you challenge that? Like, what happens when a boss or a partner questions her competence or asks for equal physical output or demands actual reciprocity in a relationship?
The moment the pressure is applied, she retreats instantly to the Motte. She pulls up the drawbridge and says, "How dare you? I am a strong, independent woman who earned her own success and needs no man." She presents the highly defensible Motte of pure self-sufficiency, but as soon as the argument is over, she goes right back down to the Bailey, demanding that the heavy lifting be done for her. So she lives in the Bailey of dependency, but she debates from the Motte of independence.
But, I mean, let me stop you there because we really have to look at the sheer physics of this.
Mm.
If we look at the raw arithmetic of a 24-hour day, this having it all lifestyle, being a full-time executive, a fully present mother, keeping a pristine home, hitting the gym, maintaining a vibrant social life, it is mathematically, physically impossible for one human being to accomplish without collapsing from sheer exhaustion.
Riker completely agrees with you. She points out that the math of the universe simply does not bend for feminist ideology.
Right.
If you subtract 8 hours for sleep and let's say 10 hours for a commute and a full corporate workday, you are left with exactly 6 hours. And you have to divide those 6 hours among your children, your marriage, your health, your home, and your own sanity.
It's just a mathematical impossibility.
It is.
Which brings up the most glaring, uncomfortable question of this entire deep dive.
Right, jizz.
If the math makes this lifestyle impossible, who is picking up the slack?
Right.
If the lazy queen is demanding the lifestyle but mathematically cannot produce the effort required, who is paying the invoice?
And that search for who pays the invoice is where Riker's book shifts from psychology to hard economics. The search takes us completely out of the domestic sphere, out of the individual home, and into the massive macroeconomic structure of society itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Riker argues that the invoice is paid by what she calls the state husband.
The state husband. I have to say, this is arguably the most provocative, incendiary economic claim in the entire book.
It really pushes buttons.
Riker argues that female independence, like the very concept of the self-sufficient modern woman, is not actually real. She says it is a complete statistical illusion that is entirely subsidized by male labor and state redistribution.
Yes. She points to a massive hidden ledger of both physical and institutional infrastructure. Let's look at the specific tax data points she highlights. because she leans really heavily into government statistics here to prove her point.
Okay, let's hear the numbers.
According to IRS data, men consistently pay approximately 70 to 72% of all net federal income taxes in the United States. Conversely, when you look at public consumption, women consume approximately 80% of healthcare spending and the vast majority of social safety net resources.
That is a staggering asymmetry.
Yeah.
Right? It means the system is fundamentally unbalanced by design.
Riker calls it a civilizational transfer payment system. The state operates as this massive engine that redistributes male productive labor and capital directly into female consumption and security. And she argues that it does this without requiring any of the reciprocity, loyalty, or duty that the traditional marriage covenant once enforced.
Which is why she calls the modern welfare state a substitute husband with the serial numbers filed off.
Yes, exactly.
Let's think about that for a second. The state steps in to provide the resources, housing assistance, healthcare, education subsidies, child tax credits. It extracts those resources primarily from the taxes of men working full-time.
Right.
But unlike an actual husband in a traditional marriage, the state is just this faceless bureaucracy.
It doesn't ask for anything in return.
Right. It doesn't demand gratitude. It doesn't demand fidelity. It doesn't ask you to compromise on your weekend plans or cook a meal. It just provides infinitely and invisibly.
And it allows the woman to really feel independent because her name is on the apartment lease, right? While completely obscuring the macro level reality that the wealth securing that lease was actually transferred from a male taxpayer she has never even met.
A phantom provider.
Exactly. But Riker extends this hidden ledger far beyond just tax brackets and IRS data. She takes it out into the physical world. She cites 2023 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to make a profound point about physical risk.
I have those BLS numbers right here, actually. And when you see them stacked together, they are just stark.
Go ahead, read them.
Okay, so in 2023, men made up 97.6% of all construction workers.
Yeah.
97.4% of oil and gas extraction workers, 96.8% of long-haul truck drivers, 95.7% of electricians, and 98.2% of plumbers. We were talking about near total monopolies on the most grueling, dirty labor.
Riker points out that these professions are the literal physical scaffolding of human civilization. The roads we drive on, the bridges that miraculously don't collapse, the electrical grids that keep the lights on, the really complex sewer systems that prevent disease, the undersea fiber optic cables that allow us to use the internet, all of it is engineered, constructed, and maintained almost exclusively by men.
And they are doing it in incredibly dangerous, physically destructive conditions that dramatically lower their life expectancy.
Yes.
It makes me think of a corporate PR department.
How so?
Well, imagine a modern independent woman as the sleek, highly paid PR department of a massive global corporation.
Right.
She's sitting in a beautiful climate-controlled office on the 40th floor. She's sending out these press releases, taking all the credit for this beautiful finished product, broadcasting her total independence and girl boss status to the world.
Right, taking the victory lap.
Exactly. But she is completely, willfully ignoring the factory floor 40 stories below her, which represents the male-dominated trades. Down there, people are breathing in toxic fumes, breaking their backs, and literally risking their lives in dangerous conditions to actually build the product she is standing on.
Riker actually uses an almost identical framing to your PR analogy. She writes a passage where she describes a modern feminist typing an essay arguing that men are completely obsolete.
Oh, it's irony.
But, Riker notes, she is typing that essay on a laptop fabricated in a facility built by men, using an electrical grid maintained by men, transmitting over an internet network laid by men, while sitting in a temperature-controlled high-rise erected by men, powered by oil pumped by men.
So she's completely insulated.
She lives entirely inside the protective shell of the male body of civilization, and yet she has the sheer audacity to declare that shell a prison.
Wow. So if we accept Riker's premise that this massive, invisible infrastructure subsidizes female autonomy, what happens when we look at the visible economy? Like, what happens when this ideology of the lazy queen enters the highest echelons of the corporate world?
Well, if the corporate world is optimizing entirely for emotional comfort rather than actual productive output, It implies a fundamental shift in how institutions operate. And Riker argues this isn't just an HR problem.
Yeah.
No, it's a total redefinition of workplace reality. She dives really deep into the critique of modern corporate culture, particularly in the aftermath of the #MeToo movement.
Yeah, she argues that as HR departments expanded exponentially over the last decade, they engaged in a practice she calls climate modification.
Yes. So instead of expecting adult resilience from employees, which is the traditional expectation that you leave your personal feelings at the door and just execute the job, Riker argues the corporate thermostat was systematically adjusted purely for female emotional comfort.
Workplaces became completely obsessed with softened lighting, endless emotional support modules, mandatory sensitivity training, and designated safe spaces.
And she claims this had a catastrophic effect on actual productivity.
She points at data suggesting that mixed-sex workplace productivity measurably declined because men, recognizing the extreme liability of this new environment, adopted defensive avoidance strategies.
It's the Mike Pence rule goes corporate.
Exactly. Men literally stopped taking closed-door one-on-one meetings with female colleagues. They stopped offering critical mentorship to young women, simply out of fear that a misunderstood comment could be retroactively weaponized against them to end their careers.
The institutional trust completely fractured.
And this is where she takes direct aim at two massive mainstream feminist corporate theories that try to explain why women still lag in CEO positions. First, let's look at the broken rung theory. This was highly popularized by a 2023 McKinsey report. The theory claims that women aren't promoted from entry-level management to senior leadership at the same rate as men purely because of systemic unconscious bias. Riker completely rejects that premise, doesn't she?
Oh, she shreds it. Riker argues the broken rung isn't about bias at all. She attributes the promotion gap to measurable biological and psychological differences in assertiveness, risk tolerance, and continuous career commitment.
But wait, how does she account for decades of documented wage gap research? I mean, does she just ignore the idea that a boys' club might actually exist and actively keep women out?
She doesn't ignore it, but she recontextualizes it entirely. She argues that the boys' club isn't some malicious conspiracy of exclusion. She says it's a brotherhood forged in the fires of extreme liability.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning to reach the C-suite, you have to be willing to absorb massive amounts of stress. You have to work 80 hours a week for a decade, relocate your family on a moment's notice, and take on the personal, legal, and financial liability of a company's survival. Riker argues that, on average, men are far more willing to subject themselves to that level of absolute misery for the ultimate payoff of status. Women, she claims, had a certain level of middle management. Look at the brutal lifestyle required to move higher and rationally choose work-life balance instead.
Which is a perfectly fine choice to make.
Yes, but instead of admitting they chose comfort over status, Riker says they blame the broken rung. She says the institution is always commanded to bend backward to accommodate the woman, but the woman is never asked to stretch to meet the standard.
Man. And then she tackles the glass cliff.
Oh, this is a big one.
This is a concept originally researched by Ryan and Haslam back in 2005. The glass cliff describes the phenomenon where women are often appointed to leadership roles, like CEO, during times of severe crisis. So when the company is already failing and the chance of success is incredibly low.
Right.
Mainstream feminism treats this as a deliberate, malicious conspiracy by male boards to basically set women up to fail so they can point and say, see, women can't lead.
But Riker flips that narrative completely on its head. She calls the glass cliff an accountability shield.
An accountability shield, how does that work?
She argues that when a company is in a death spiral, desperate boards roll the dice on untested candidates, hoping for a miracle PR turnaround.
Okay, that makes sense.
But here is the critical difference in Riker's view. When the female CEO inevitably fails to save the sinking ship, she is protected by the accountability shield. She gets a massive multi-million-dollar golden parachute severance package. She gets to write a best-selling memoir about the entrenched systemic sexism and toxic masculinity she faced while trying to lead.
Right, she becomes a martyr.
Exactly, and the media celebrates her as a brave, traumatized trailblazer.
Whereas a man in the exact same position.
When a male CEO inherits a failing company and can't save it, he is simply fired. He is deemed totally incompetent. He doesn't get a lucrative memoir deal. He gets a quiet, shameful entry in a corporate database somewhere. He is forced to absorb the total weight of the failure. The woman's failure is externalized onto the system, but the man's failure is internalized as a personal defect.
which ties right into how she applies Parkinson's law of triviality to these female-dominated corporate spaces.
Yes, the bike shedding effect.
Right. For those unfamiliar, Parkinson's law of triviality, or the bike shedding effect, is this idea that organizations will spend the vast majority of their time arguing over the most trivial, inconsequential issues simply because they are the easiest for everyone to comprehend.
It's a classic organizational flaw.
A committee will spend 5 minutes approving a $10 million nuclear reactor and then spend 3 hours arguing over what materials to use for the employee bike shed.
Right, and Riker claims that as corporate committees become more female-dominated, Parkinson's law accelerates dramatically. She argues these committees will spend hours agonizing over the color palette of a new logo, or the emotional inclusivity of a mission statement, or the precise, non-triggering wording of an internal diversity memo.
While completely avoiding the brutal, high-stakes, mathematically complex financial decisions.
Exactly, because deciding to cut a department's budget by 20% or firing incompetent staff to keep the company solvent, that requires someone to be the bad guy. It requires direct conflict.
Which goes against the climate modification goal.
Right. Riker argues these committees optimize for comfort, for consensus, and for the photographed performance of harmony. Meanwhile, the actual brutal labor of keeping the company from going bankrupt is quietly shifted to the men in the organization who avoid the committees, keep their heads down, and just do the math.
But I have to push back here on behalf of you, the listener, because this seems like an incredibly harsh, almost completely uncharitable reading of corporate soft skills.
It's definitely unforgiving.
Right. I mean, is it not possible that prioritizing emotional safety and consensus actually does have a bottom line return on investment? Doesn't it prevent catastrophic burnout? Doesn't it retain top talent who would otherwise just leave a toxic environment? Does Riker really view emotional intelligence as entirely parasitic?
She does view it as parasitic in the context of institutional survival.
Wow.
Riker's counterargument is that you simply cannot eat emotional labor, you cannot heat a building with validation, you cannot pay shareholders with the feeling of inclusivity.
I see her point, but it's cold.
To her, elevating comfort management to the status of essential survival infrastructure is a massive category error, and it is usually disguised as a moral argument. She believes that a corporation's only duty is to produce a product or service efficiently, and that turning the office into a therapeutic space simply drains resources and shifts the heavy lifting onto a shrinking pool of hyperproductive workers.
Man, okay, if the corporate world is optimizing entirely for emotional comfort, it implies a fundamental shift in how we define harm.
Right. Riker argues this isn't just an HR problem. She says it's a total redefinition of objective reality. And that brings us to what she calls the feeling verdict.
This is perhaps the most chilling chapter in the book. Riker argues that modern society has crossed a philosophical Rubicon. We have fundamentally elevated emotional subjectivity, so how someone feels about an event over the objective physical reality of what actually happened.
So, the instant a woman feels slighted, uncomfortable, or regretful, a transgression is assumed to have objectively occurred. Her internal, unprovable feeling is treated by institutions as infallible external evidence.
Exactly, and she uses a harrowing, highly detailed case study to illustrate the terrifying endpoint of this philosophy.
The 2018 Title IX case.
Yes, she examines a 2018 Title IX case at a large public university in the Midwest. The documented physical facts of the case were not in dispute by either party. A female student planned, orchestrated, and initiated a consensual sexual encounter with a male classmate. And the evidence was ironclad, right? She sent text messages to her friends beforehand detailing her enthusiastic plans.
Yes, she was completely the architect of the encounter.
Okay, so what happened?
The next morning, she wakes up with a hangover, she feels a sense of regret. Maybe the encounter wasn't as romantic as she hoped, or she felt embarrassed. She processes that internal feeling of discomfort and decides that she must have been wronged. She walks into the university's Title IX office and reports the male student for sexual assault.
Now, in a normal court of law, the text messages proving she initiated it would immediately clear him.
Exactly. And the text messages were entered into evidence during the university hearing, clearly proving she was the willing architect of the event. But the university tribunal, which Riker notes was composed entirely of female administrators trained in this new ideology, expelled the young man anyway.
Wait, on what possible grounds? If the physical evidence proved consent, how do you justify expulsion?
The tribunal's written justification cited that the female student's retroactive feeling of being violated constituted institutional harm.
Are you kidding?
No. Riker points to this as the pure, terrifying manifestation of the feeling verdict. A young man's academic career, his reputation, his future earning potential, all of it was reduced to ash. Not based on a timeline of physical facts, not based on violence or coercion, but based entirely on a woman's retroactive mood swing.
It's absolute madness. It's like a legal system where a weather report of rain is accepted as absolute proof that someone intentionally flooded your house.
It's a great way to put it.
Like the fact that you are standing in a puddle means someone committed a crime against you, regardless of whether they were even in the same state at the time. The feeling of being wet is the only evidence required for a conviction.
That is a perfect analogy for Riker's critique. The feeling generates the crime. To combat this institutional insanity, Riker proposes a very practical, if somewhat stark, tool for men to use to defend themselves. She calls it the chronology test.
Okay, how does the chronology test work in practice?
When a grievance is presented, whether it's in a corporate HR meeting or an argument with a partner, she advises men to demand a written, strictly physical timeline of events. You write down the timeline, but you must strip out every single adjective.
So no descriptive words.
Right. Remove every adverb characterizing tone or intention. Delete any reference to internal emotional states.
So you can't say, he aggressively looked at me. You just say, he looked at me.
Exactly. Just the pure physics of what occurred in the room. Who stood where, who said what words, who touched what. Riker argues that in 90% of modern interpersonal disputes, if you remove the emotional scaffolding, the assumptions of toxic intent, the claims of microaggressions, the crime completely vanishes.
Because it wasn't a crime.
Right. If the crime disappears when the adjectives disappear, then there was no crime. It was just a mood. And moods, she insists, are not actionable evidence.
Okay, so if this is how massive institutional conflicts are being resolved, with fluid feelings superseding hard facts, how does this emotional weaponization play out behind closed doors? Like, what happens when you apply the feeling verdict to the privacy of a marriage?
That is the focus of a deeply pessimistic section of the book, which Riker grimly titles The Neutering.
Ooh.
Yeah. She breaks down step by step how this exact style of emotional warfare destroys male leadership in the home.
We hear this complaint constantly in modern culture, don't we? From sociologists to daytime talk shows, they say men are checking out. Husbands are withdrawing from their families. They're retreating to the garage, hiding in video games, or just staring at their phones during dinner.
It's a huge talking point right now.
And the standard mainstream cultural narrative is always that these men are lazy, or they suffer from Peter Pan syndrome, or they're just emotionally stunted and refuse to grow up.
But Riker completely flips that script. She argues fiercely that these men did not leave the building emotionally because they are lazy. They left because they are exhausted.
Exhausted by what?
They have been subjected to 1,000 daily microscopic corrections. They are being processed to death by a partner who treats every interaction as an HR violation.
It's the sadistic double bind of vulnerability. Society, therapists, popular podcasts, everyone screams at men, you need to open up, share your feelings, stop being so stoic, and be vulnerable with your partner.
Right. But Riker observes a very dark reality. The moment a man actually does open up, the moment his vulnerability contradicts his wife's narrative or challenges her feelings, it is instantly weaponized against him.
It's a trap.
It's a perfectly designed trap. If he calmly explains his perspective, she diagnoses him as defensive. If he gets frustrated by the circular arguing, she labels him toxic or abusive. If he sets a firm boundary, he's controlling. If he goes quiet to avoid escalating a fight he knows he can't win, he's stonewalling or emotionally withdrawn.
So the game is rigged so the house always wins. No matter what move the man makes, the therapeutic language is twisted to ensure he remains the villain.
And the house is never held accountable. Riker says men aren't stupid. They eventually realize that participating in these endless emotional processing sessions is a rigged game. So they simply stop talking. The withdrawal, the checking out, the video games, it isn't laziness. It is a highly rational survival strategy to avoid continuous emotional flagellation.
And she identifies a very specific modern technological mechanism that accelerates this marital decay.
Right.
Something that didn't exist 50 years ago.
Yes. The girlfriend group chat.
The group chat. This is a fascinating intersection of clinical psychology and modern technology. Riker brings in the renowned marital research of Dr. John Gottman.
Yes, anyone who has studied relationship psychology knows Gottman.
Right. He famously identified contempt as the deadliest relationship killer. He can observe a couple for 5 minutes, and if he sees contempt, he can predict their divorce with over 90% accuracy.
It's terrifyingly accurate.
But let's define contempt for a second, because it's not just anger, right?
No, not at all. Anger is an emotion directed at an action. Like, I'm mad you didn't take out the trash. Contempt is an attack on the person's character. It's the signaling through eye-rolling, sneering, or mocking that you view your partner as fundamentally defective, disgusting, or beneath you. Contempt is sulfuric acid to love.
And how does the iPhone group chat fit into Gottman's theory of contempt?
Well, Riker applies Cass Sunstein's theory of group polarization to the dynamic of the group chat. Sunstein's research on group dynamics shows that when like-minded people deliberate on a topic in a closed loop, they don't moderate their views.
They don't calm down.
No, they radicalize each other. They push each other to the most extreme version of their shared belief.
So paint a picture of how this works on, like, a random Tuesday night. A wife is annoyed, so she texts her group chat a mild complaint, my husband is working late again, so annoying.
Exactly. In the past, she might have just grumbled to herself and moved on. But because the group chat acts as an enclosed echo chamber that socially rewards drama, outrage, and blind solidarity, the friends immediately escalate it.
Oh, totally. He always does this.
Right. He doesn't respect your time. My therapist says that's a red flag for narcissism. By the end of the night, the group hasn't just sympathized with a mild complaint. They have collectively diagnosed this man as a covert, abusive narcissist and recommended a trauma therapist.
Wow.
Riker frames the modern group chat as a literal contempt generation machine. It institutionalizes and amplifies contempt for the men in their lives.
But I really need to push back here. Thinking about you, the listener, who might be in one of those group chats right now, are we not just pathologizing normal, healthy venting? I mean, people need to blow off steam. Marriage is hard. When does blowing off steam with your friends turn into the dangerous institutionalization of contempt?
Yeah.
Isn't Riker being a bit paranoid?
Riker anticipates that defense, actually, and she would argue that it crosses the line when the venting becomes a daily, rehearsed ritual that entirely replaces direct, honest communication with the spouse.
So it's the frequency and the replacement of real talk.
Yes. When you rehearse disliking your husband 5 days a week in a chat, you cannot magically turn around and show genuine, vulnerable affection on the weekend. The neural pathways of contempt have been strengthened and validated by your peer group. You have built a fortress of resentment that your husband doesn't even know exists.
Which relies on a much deeper psychological defense mechanism, doesn't it? The wife in that scenario isn't looking at her own communication failures. She's projecting the blame entirely outward onto her husband.
Absolutely.
And this takes us into a deeply philosophical part of the book, the projection trap and hypergamy inflation.
Yes. To explain this projection, Riker resurrects Carl Jung's concept of the animus. Now, Jungian psychology is incredibly complex, but for our purposes, it deals with the unconscious mind and the shadow.
The shadow self.
Right, the shadow contains all the parts of ourselves that we are deeply ashamed of, our failures, our weaknesses, our unmet potential. Riker argues that the modern feminist is carrying an immense amount of subconscious shame because the having it all promise failed to deliver happiness.
And that shame is too heavy to carry. The ego would literally collapse under the weight of admitting, I made the wrong choices with my life.
Exactly. So to protect the ego from death, the psyche employs the animus projection. The intense shame of falling short of one's own desires is launched outward like a spear. It is projected onto an external target.
So instead of a woman looking in the mirror and saying, I didn't work hard enough to edit this manuscript, which is why it was rejected, the ego protects itself by saying, the publishing industry is a sexist boys club that silenced my authentic voice.
Precisely. Every internal judgment becomes an external accusation. The system is rigged. The industry is corrupt. The patriarchy is holding me down. And very often, if there isn't a convenient institution to blame, the nearest man, a husband, a boyfriend, a male colleague, is forced to wear the shame that she refuses to carry.
He becomes the avatar for her disappointment.
He does.
So to break this cycle of projection, Riker offers a very harsh mental exercise. She calls it the discipline test.
The discipline test is brutal but effective. She tells her readers to take any grievance they have against society, against men, or against their boss, and force themselves to rewrite the grievance, starting with the exact words, I failed to.
Okay, so I failed to write a manuscript that competes in the market. I failed to negotiate my salary effectively. I failed to communicate my needs to my husband.
Yes. It forces a terrifying confrontation with personal agency. It entirely removes the phantom patriarchy from the equation and puts the responsibility back on the individual. It kills the projection.
But taking that kind of radical responsibility is incredibly hard when the culture is constantly inflating your expectations of what you are inherently owed just for existing.
Oh, completely.
Riker calls this cultural mechanism the hypergamy inflation engine. But let's break down hypergamy first, because that's a term thrown around the manosphere a lot. What does it actually mean here?
Hypergamy is the established historical and evolutionary tendency of women to seek partners of equal or higher status, whether that status is measured in wealth, physical strength, or social dominance. For most of human history, that standard was localized. A woman compared the men in her village.
But Riker argues that social media algorithms have broken this mechanism, creating an impossible synthetic standard.
The composite man.
Yes, the composite man. The hypergamy inflation engine feeds the modern woman an amalgamation of elite traits that do not exist in any single human being on Earth.
They literally can't exist together.
Right. Through her phone screen, she is programmed to want the limitless wealth, the private jets, and the surprise luxury vacations of an Instagram influencer's husband. At the same time, she wants the rugged, wood-chopping, house-building masculine utility of a TikTok trad wife's farmer husband.
Right.
And simultaneously, she demands the docile, boundaryless, emotional submission and constant verbal validation of a corporate girl boss's stay-at-home partner.
She wants a billionaire lumberjack who acts like a submissive therapist.
Yes. And when she measures the real, exhausted, slightly balding man sitting on her couch, the man who is working 60 hours a week to pay her mortgage, against this Frankenstein's monster of algorithmic perfection.
He is always found guilty of what Riker brilliantly terms insufficient magic. He fails a test where the rubric was designed by algorithms optimized to make women feel perpetually dissatisfied.
It's just so bleak. And Riker actually pinpoints a specific cultural moment where she believes this entitlement, this projection of impossible standards, crossed the point of absolutely no return. She points to a highly publicized scandal from a few years ago.
Yes, she points to the 2018 Aziz Ansari story.
Right.
For those who don't remember, in early 2018, at the height of the hashtag MeToo movement, a website called babe.net published a long, anonymous account of a date with the comedian Aziz Ansari. The woman described what was, by all legal and objective measures, a completely consensual sexual encounter.
But she didn't like it.
Right. It was awkward, it lacked chemistry, and she simply regretted it in hindsight. By her own written admission, when she eventually indicated she wanted to stop, he responded to the cues, he stopped, he got her clothes, and he paid for a car to take her home.
Yet the article and the terrifying cultural reaction that followed treated this mundane bad date as a structural violation, akin to actual assault.
Riker calls this the Rubicon. It was the moment the mainstream feminist movement completely abandoned any pretense of proportionality or objective reality. A clumsy, disappointing first date was elevated to the status of deep trauma, based solely on the woman's subjective lived experience.
And lived experience is a phrase that functions as a shield, doesn't it?
It functions as an unfalsifiable weapon. Riker argues that lived experience stripped the accused of any right to defense. If a man tried to present physical facts or text messages to defend himself, the very act of defending himself was labeled as gaslighting and seen as further invalidation of her feelings. It cemented the feeling verdict into the culture.
Okay, so we've walked through this incredibly bleak, almost dystopian diagnostic landscape. The illusion of autonomy is debunked, relationships are drowning in algorithmic contempt, the workplace is paralyzed by emotional liability, and expectations for men are mathematically impossible.
That's a rough X-ray.
If the X-ray is this ugly, what is the surgery? What is Riker's proposed solution to all this? How do we get out of the muddy waters?
She outlines her path forward in a section she calls The Way Back, and her solution is a full-throated, unapologetic defense of the 1950s and the traditional patriarchal two-parent household.
Which is going to be incredibly jarring, if not outright offensive, for a lot of people to hear. The 1950s housewife is the ultimate boogeyman of modern feminism.
Undoubtedly. But Riker argues that the traditional family structure, a providing, protective father and a home-oriented, nurturing mother, was not a prison designed to oppress women. No. She claims the historical and biological data proves it was an economically grounded system of mutual protection. She argues that this structure produced the lowest risk, highest stability environment for women and children in recorded human history.
And she points to the data on that, right? Drastically lower rates of child poverty, significantly lower rates of maternal depression, lower rates of divorce, and better educational outcomes for children compared to literally any alternative arrangement we have experimented with since.
Yes. And to get back to that stability, she challenges women to embrace what she calls radical responsibility. This involves a practical, physical exercise she assigns to her readers called the maintenance audit.
I find this concept fascinating because it brings all this high-level sociological theory out of the abstract and forces it into the physical reality of daily life. How does the maintenance audit work?
She tells women to literally stand up, put down their phones, and walk through their homes to acknowledge the hidden ledger we discussed earlier. She wants them to look at the electrical panel in the basement installed by a man, look at the water heater that provides hot showers manufactured and repaired by a man, look at the roof keeping the rain off their heads, shingled by men working in the blistering heat.
So the goal of the maintenance audit is to violently shatter the illusion of total independence, to force the realization that you are inherently dependent on the grueling labor, risk, and sacrifice of men you will never even meet.
Exactly. And from that realization of dependence, the call to action for the reader is a fundamental paradigm shift in how they view the world. You have to stop waking up every morning and asking the universe, what am I owed today? What are my rights?
And start asking, what can I offer today? What are my duties?
It is a complete return to mutual dependence. It's recognizing that true love requires needing someone and being needed in return. It requires reciprocal sacrifice, not isolated, combative autonomy.
But I really have to point out the massive friction here. What Riker is demanding is revolutionary in reverse. She is essentially telling modern women to hand back the keys to the kingdom they have spent the last 60 years fighting for.
Oh, it's a huge ask.
She's telling them the independence they've built their entire identities around is a mirage, subsidized by male tax dollars and male physical labor. That is a massive, bitter pill to swallow. Why would anyone willingly swallow it?
Raker acknowledges that it's a bitter pill, but she argues it's the only medicine that will cure the civilizational disease of loneliness and resentment. She writes a very powerful closing line. Comfort has never produced clarity. You have to set down the comforting fantasy of having it all to pick up the heavy reality of a meaningful life.
Wow. Okay, let's bring this all together. We have just unpacked a truly exhaustive, uncompromising text. Riker's book, Women Want Power, But Love Cancels Will for Power, presents a stark challenge to everything modern culture holds sacred. Her argument is that true power isn't found in isolated autonomy, but in reciprocal duty, mutual dependence, and acknowledging the hidden ledger of male labor that built and continues to maintain human civilization.
And again, it is crucial for our listeners to understand that whether you agree with Raker's conclusions or find her arguments deeply offensive, this book is a key cipher for decoding the massive ideological shifts happening right now.
Definitely.
You cannot understand the manosphere, men's rights activism, or the modern political fracture without understanding these specific arguments about institutional capture, the grand swap, and the feeling verdict.
Exactly. If you want to read this fascinating, highly controversial text for yourself, grapple with the data she presents and form your own conclusions, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook.
And for ongoing commentary on these issues, you can follow the author at Conrad Riker at Substack, as well as at Conrad Riker on Twitter and at Conrad Riker on YouTube.
And please make sure you hit the like button on this video and subscribe to the podcast so we can keep bringing you these deep dives into the texts that are actively shaping our world.
We always try to leave you with something to chew on, something that builds on the material we covered today, but takes it a step further into the future.
Right. So think back to our discussion about the hidden ledger of physical labor Riker talks about. The men building the roads, laying the fiber optic cables, maintaining the power grids, doing all the dangerous jobs that keep society running. Here's a thought to mull over.
Lay it on us.
If Riker is right, and total independence is indeed a myth, because true sovereignty requires a hidden ledger of grueling physical labor that someone else has to perform, then what happens in our highly automated AI-driven future?
Oh, that's a good question.
When human physical labor is eventually outsourced entirely to advanced machines and robotics, and that male-dominated hidden ledger completely disappears, will the gender wars naturally resolve themselves because the fundamental economic imbalance is fixed? Or will human nature prevail, and will we just find brand new, even more complex ways to weaponize our emotional and technological dependence on each other?
That is a terrifying and fascinating question to leave on.
Thanks for joining us in the deep end. We'll see you next time.